is August 18th, 2018. This is another episode of the Afterburners podcast where we bring you football news and burns of the week involving primarily quarterback news. And I am on the podcast by myself. My co-host Sam, who you all know and love, is sick. He actually came over here to record the podcast, coughed a lung up, and I sent him home like I was a nurse at elementary school. So instead of Sam, I am joined by Greg Smith, who is a co-founder of 2QBs.com. He is a founder of GameFlow Botics and a draft day consultant. And Greg, just because I'm not quite familiar with it, and I'm sure some of our audience isn't as well, what exactly do you do with GameFlow Botics?
So yeah, GameFlow Botics is the spreadsheet that I put out every week at 2QBs.com. That's, you got to spell that out. There's no numbers. It's TWOQBS. It's basically like a matchup spreadsheet where I take each game and I lay out each team and like kind of show their fantasy options and I show a bunch of like relevant statistics to kind of try to piece together how the matchup is going to play out holistically. So I show the betting line, I show the over-under, and then I'm also looking at like DVOA numbers from Football Outsiders, and I'm kind of like color coding them so they match up together. So you'll see that like one team's defense matches up against one team's offense, and then one team's passing offense matches up against one team's passing defense, and you can see like how those numbers compare to each other. And hopefully like DVOA is not predictive. Let me preface by saying that, but hopefully like with, you know, a general overview of like what the strengths and weaknesses are of each team, we can try to figure out how teams are going to try to attack each other, and try to maybe predict a little bit of the game flow and the game script, hence the name Game Flow Botics. So it's, you know, we're trying to turn game flow into a robotic exercise. That's what I tell myself, and it doesn't always work, of course, but you know, things in fantasy football rarely always work, and that's why we like playing the game, because it's really hard to figure out and it's a lot of fun to try to figure it out, right?
Yeah, that quote from Anchorman just came to mind of 60% of the time it works 100% of the time. Is that it?
That's it, man. Sex Panther.
Yeah, exactly. So if you like Sex Panther, check out GameFlow Botics. That's what we're saying here.
It smells like a used diaper full of Indian food.
Yeah, and speaking of used diapers that smell like Indian food, I actually don't know where I was going with that, but I want to talk about the most handsome man on the entire NFL, and that is Jimmy Garoppolo. I'm doing this primarily because I heard from our good friend Sal Stefanale that you, Greg, are a 49ers fan. Is that correct, or was he misleading me?
No, that is correct. I'm from the Bay Area. I grew up a Niners fan, so like I was there through the glory years. Like I was a kid for Joe Montana, but I was like a young man and a teenager for like Steve Young. So I was indoctrinated very early into the Niners, and then then I suffered through the Jeff Garcia and Tim Rattay years. So like I've seen both ends of the spectrum here. It's kind of exciting to see Garoppolo finally show up. He's probably like the best quarterback prospect we've had in a really long time.
Yeah, and before we get into any football talk, because on this podcast we've talked intensely about Jimmy Garoppolo, Jimmy GQ, as some people know him as. I've mentioned before, if he showed up at my wedding, I don't know if I would have gotten married. So on your QB handsomeness rankings, where does he fall? Is he number one, or are you more like Sam, where Cam Newton is your number one, or do you have an out of left field number one?
Yeah, I tend to judge that stuff by like how worried I would be if my wife was in the same room as one of these people, and like, or like when we're watching football together, she'd be like, "Oh, who's that?" And it's like she started to do that with Garoppolo last season because the Niners games are always on here in the Bay, so that is a little troublesome. And I think based upon that, it's got to be Jimmy GQ just because he's so prominent like in my life. But there are definitely arguments to be made for. I think Cam is up there. Jay Cutler was definitely up there for a while, but he's no longer active, so he's out. Who am I missing? Who else is out there that ranks high on the handsome scale?
According to my wife, and also just according to me, I can admit when a man is handsome. Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, Aaron Rodgers looks like my buddy Jason. Like they don't look that much alike, but they have like the same like kind of deep eye sockets. And I don't know, like it's a little off-putting to me. I have another friend, like a male friend, who looks like Julia Stiles, the actress. Which we always give him shit for. But I don't know. That every time like somebody looks like somebody I know, like they're not handsome. They're just my friend. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I totally understand how that works. My friend Zach has been told a few times that he looks like James Franco. And ever since making that connection, I can't see James Franco without thinking of Zach, and same idea there.
Once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it must be even weirder when it's cross-gender, like you were mentioning with your friend with Julia Stiles.
Yeah, that's probably the weirdest one I can come up with. And it's more that like she looks like him than he looks like her. Because I'm not going to get into it anyway. I don't know how I make that distinction, but that's how it works for me.
Fair enough. And now we can actually get into some football talk. So I'm sure.
Now, hold on. I thought this was a podcast dedicated to Afterburner, the arcade game. Are we really just going to talk about football?
We really are just going to talk about football.
God damn it. Okay, fine.
What is the arcade game, though, now that you've brought it up?
Oh, man. I've immediately dated myself as a child of the 80s. This is bad. It was like one of those kind of flight sim action games where like you would sit in a little chair in the arcade game and there was a joystick. And sometimes like if you went to like the fancy arcade, they would have the one that like the chair would move as you toggle the joystick and fly around. But basically just like Top Gun, the video game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm actually familiar with that. I think I've played it. I just wasn't sure what it was called because I used to go to arcades a bunch. For people, new listeners who don't know,
what an arcade is?
If you've never been to an arcade, go to one. There's a bunch of barcades around different cities. I live in New York, so there are a few of those here. I'm sure they exist in other cities as well. But for those who don't know, Afterburners, this podcast my friend Sam and our co-host Sam was coming up with a podcast, and we asked our league what we should name it because originally it was based on a particular league or born out of a particular league. And one of our friends said Afterburners because supposedly he had just taken a hot, spicy dump. So that's what we decided to call our podcast, and that's the name. It's not anything that fantastic. We're literally named after hot, spicy poops.
That's great. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, you should be. Great podcast to be on, right?
Oh man! Before we talk more about Garoppolo, can we call out Sam for being sick? Can I just give the Jarvis Landry speech? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know what the fuck has been going on here, and I don't know why it's been going on here. But if you're not hurting, if your hamstring isn't falling off the fucking bone, your leg ain't broke. I don't know. You should be fucking practicing or podcasting. Like straight up, that shit is weakness, and that shit is contagious as fuck. That shit ain't gonna be in this room, bruh. That shit been in here in the past, and that's why the past has been like it is, bruh. That shit is over with, bruh. If you're gonna fucking practice or podcast. See, I'm already screwing it up. You can't get no better by being on the fucking sideline if you ain't fucking hurt. If you ain't fucking hurt, you gotta fucking practice because you make other motherfuckers work even fucking harder. Now, he ain't gonna risk getting fucking hurt because you ain't gonna fucking practice because I can't keep going. That's why I run out of steam.
So we definitely curse on this podcast, but you might have just taken the award for most curses in one episode.
I was just quoting Jarvis Landry. That's not on my hands.
That's completely fair. And also to Sam's defense, as I said, I did actually send him home. He did show up, and I sent him home because he was coughing and he had no voice whatsoever and he hadn't slept in days. I don't know why he even bothered showing up.
So that shit isn't Sam's weakness. That shit is your weakness, Bobby.
Yeah, I couldn't take it. I had to get him out of here.
Thanks for letting me do that. That was fun.
Yeah, no problem at all. That was entertaining. I'm sure when Sam's editing it, he'll like listening to it as well.
He'll just edit the whole thing out is what he should do.
Knowing Sam, he'll probably leave it in, but Sam will also be very happy that we are talking about Jimmy Garoppolo because Sam loves Jimmy G, at least to the point where he loves him for handsomeness. I'm not sure how he feels about his quarterbacking, though, and that's something I wanted to ask you about specifically because, as you know, being around on Twitter, Jimmy GQ is like the next number one quarterback option. Everyone's all in already because he's paired up with Kyle Shanahan. And I wanted your take, both from a fan perspective, and I don't know if you can actually separate it out, but from a fan perspective and an analysis perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good at separating my fandom from my analysis of players. Like I said, I suffered through the bad parts of the Niners years, and that was pretty disenfranchising, to be honest. Like, I've definitely root for my fantasy teams harder than I root for any franchises in any sport these days. Like I grew up like a San Francisco Giants fan too, and I don't know, I can hardly even watch baseball at this point. Like I like to go to games, I like to watch occasional games like playoff baseball, but like the grind of the regular season isn't for me. So just in general, like I'm pretty good at filtering out my personal fan biases from my analysis of the player. And with Garoppolo, it's interesting. Like I think at like a real football level, I am buying the Garoppolo hype. Like I said before, he's the best quarterback prospect the Niners have had in a really long time. And when you couple him with a good coach like Kyle Shanahan, the Niners should be more than respectable on offense this season. Like that, and that has nothing to say about their defense, like which is probably still going to be a pretty big problem. But I think that like that excellent offense that we're looking at should, or not excellent, but like above average offense that we're going to get from the Niners, that should translate to quality fantasy production for Garoppolo. But will it be enough to justify his cost in ADP? Like you talked about, he's being drafted like he's the next big thing. Like he's already, Tom Brady, or even like he's already Matthew Stafford. And I kind of doubt that he's worth that cost at this point. The quarterback position is extremely deep, and kind of that middle tier where I believe Jimmy G resides is full of similar values. Like I talked about Stafford, you could talk about Matt Ryan, Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, Marcus Mariota. Like with that in mind, it really doesn't make sense to buy into Garoppolo at a top 10 ADP, or really like any quarterback in that like QB8 to QB9 range, because you can just wait and buy someone else with a similar upside at a later point in your draft. So because Garoppolo is going higher, because Cousins is going higher, like those are the two guys I kind of view as the overvalued guys from that tier. They tend to go in that like QB8 to QB10 range. I'm not ending up with them. The guys I'm ending up with in my drafts are Matt Ryan, Ben Roethlisberger, Matthew Stafford, Marcus Mariota, because those are the guys who tend to slip a little bit more. And Stafford is kind of creeping back up there. Like he's probably early in the offseason, he was a little less highly valued. And now he's like, people are starting to catch on that like, yeah, he's been a top 10 QB for however many years in a row. And, they're adding Kenny Golladay to the mix as like more of a weapon. Like who cares if they lost Eric Ebron, because Eric Ebron is trash. Like there's stuff to like about Stafford, and like the people know Stafford's name. Like they know Matt Ryan's name, but Matt Ryan had a relatively down year last year. People are bored of drafting these guys. So I'm fine like taking that boredom discount on the guys who go at like QB12 or QB13 instead of trying to chase a ceiling with Garoppolo at QB8, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of our audience, Greg, is dynasty focused. So I guess my question for you would just be, do you still feel similarly about those quarterbacks if it's for dynasty, or was that only for redraft? Because I'm guessing you said that with redraft in mind.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I was definitely talking redraft there. So I'm not a huge dynasty guy. I dabble. I play in a couple, dynasty / keeper leagues. I'm definitely not an aficionado or expert by any means. I only analyze it kind of tangentially as it relates to my couple leagues and to the people who come on like the 2QB Experience podcast. But in general, I do think Garoppolo has more value there because he is still really young, because he is just now entering into that relationship with Kyle Shanahan, and it looks like he's going to be locked in as the coach there. They have some good young weapons around him in Kittle, Garoppolo, Marquise Goodwin, and that's something I care about in Dynasty. Like I want to make sure that like the weapons can age with the quarterback. Like if I look at Juju Smith-Schuster, like one of my biggest concerns with him has nothing to do with his talent. It has to do with the fact that Roethlisberger just might not be there, in 2 years, and that could really hamper his value, after that point. Now, with that said, I think he just caught a touchdown pass in preseason for Mason Rudolph tonight. So who knows, maybe all that is like out the window, but you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, and I definitely agree to an extent. I'm a big Juju guy, though, and I will say the one knock against him that I'll actually accept is I'm concerned about who his QB of the future is. Yeah. That's how I feel about OBJ as well. Big OBJ guy, but I do understand the concern about who's going to be passing them the ball.
I mean, that's a concern for me right now in redraft with OBJ. Like, I love that dude, but I mean, what if Eli Manning is just done? Like, that's a distinct possibility. He hasn't been good for a long time. And I mean, Pat Shurmur coming in there could help and should help, but I don't know, man. Like, that's one of the hardest decisions for me right now is like how to value Beckham relative to Hopkins, relative to Julio Jones. And even like we could even sprinkle in like AJ Green and Michael Thomas into that elite wide receiver discussion. And in Dynasty, like I think Michael Thomas has like an even better argument. But yeah, I'm like that connection between weapons and quarterback matters to me. And so to bring this back to Garoppolo, like I think that there's reason for optimism. But again, like the price is going to be so high that it's probably not worth paying just because quarterback is so deep, even in Dynasty. Like if you own Garoppolo, you should probably be entertaining trade offers for him right now just to see what you could get, especially if you're talking like 2 quarterback super flex, because, this year, I don't think he's going to be that much better than the guys I mentioned earlier for redraft. Next year, he might be better than that. But even still, it's like, what are we hoping for? Matt Ryan? Like, is that the ceiling? Like Matt Ryan's one breakout year? Like, I don't know. Tell me where you fall in this because you play more Dynasty than I do. I'm curious to hear what you think.
You can get a king's ransom right now for Jimmy Garoppolo. So if I had any shares, I would be looking to move them just based on the fact that everyone is buying into this. He's like a top 5 QB in Dynasty purposes or even 6. And I agree with you that let's say I could trade him for a Matthew Stafford plus another piece or a pick. I'd probably do that just because, as you mentioned earlier, Matthew Stafford has that safety of knowing that he's been a quarterback 1 and he's still relatively young. So I'm not quite buying in as much. I know my friend Zach is buying in. He's all in. And I guess one of my concerns is, and I imagine the Niners will address it in next year's draft, if not free agency. Marquise Goodwin, while he was good last year, is not necessarily a prototypical wide receiver 1. And I don't know that they necessarily have that like top end pass catching option on the team. And that's a little bit of a concern. I do think they do have a lot of good pieces, which helps the quarterback overall. I just don't know if they have that one quote unquote game breaking piece that can really put up a huge amount of numbers, which in turn helps their quarterback.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess what I would say to that is that they could get there. But again, that's really speculative. And that's a good reason to maybe fade Garoppolo at his price is because there's no guarantee that that'll ever happen. Like even like you look at the Browns drafting Corey Coleman and they just gave him away. They shipped him out, however many years later, like 1.5 years later, 2 years later. Like even if you draft a wide receiver in the first round, like I could throw out some more names, Rashad Perryman, Kevin White, like the Niners could think that they're getting the next big thing at wide receiver, but like we don't know that that's happening. There's no way to guarantee that at all. Like you're right. It's a really good downside.
That was also a laundry list of players who have broken my heart in Dynasty. All of them, I've fallen into that trap pretty much.
Right. But if we're connecting that sort of stuff to the quarterback, like what if Rashad Perriman had hit? Would the Ravens have drafted Lamar Jackson? If Corey Coleman had hit, like what would, Deshaun Kaiser's season have looked like last season? Like, I don't know. Like, it's hard to say. And generally, I think that if these guys don't perform on the field, that does mean something. Like, I'd rather lean on, what we see in the games as opposed to what we can speculate towards, because you can imagine all sorts of different scenarios, right? Like the fantasy football is all about that, but in the end, like these guys have to produce. And if they're not going to do that, like, the fortunes of these teams are going to change.
Yeah. And it is a good question. Part of Dynasty is speculation, but you do also have to see results on the field. And, I do wonder sometimes though, and I think you somewhat hinted at it, is it talent by the wide receiver that brings out talent in the quarterback? Is it vice versa? Obviously a good quarterback like Aaron Rodgers can make even quote unquote not talented wide receivers look good. But then is there also a little bit of the reverse? And I think, being a Giants fan, I always think, or at least for the past few seasons, I've thought that Odell Beckham has basically single-handedly saved Eli Manning's career or prolonged it, because he's made some ridiculous catches that were overthrown or just not well placed. And he's made him look good by putting up numbers. But I really think without him, Eli might have already been done already.
Oh, I mean, it's both. Like, it goes both ways. The talent helps talent. And on top of that, you have to worry about like coaching scheme and system and how that applies to these players. Like the usage of the player is also very important, like where they're being targeted on the field. I just did a podcast last night with Josh Hermsmeyer, for the 2QBs pod, and he talked a lot about that, like that average depth of target belongs to the receiver, and that makes sense, right? Like the receiver has to run the route, and the route is dictated by the scheme. Like you have to factor that in on top of all of this like talent discussion. So again, it really comes back to trying to have like a holistic approach as you're evaluating these situations and these players. Like if you're doing projections, you can't just project wide receivers by themselves. You have to project wide receivers within the context of their offense, within the context of the players around them, like not just the quarterback, but the other receivers. Like Odell Beckham is coming back this year. Like, what is that going to do to the target share of Evan Ingram and Sterling Shepard? They also added Saquon Barkley. Like, how is he going to impact the target share of those other players? Like, I'm curious what you think about this, because I'm of the opinion that Evan Ingram is severely overvalued at his cost. Like, he was great last year, but there was no Saquon Barkley, there was no Odell Beckham. Like, and I think people who are talking up Eli as this undervalued guy because the weapons are so great. Like, are the weapons that much greater than like 2 years ago when Beckham was healthy? I don't know. And I'm not sure of that. Like, Ingram is definitely like a very talented player, but considering his cost, considering the conservation of targets that are going to, happen there, I think that he's still being overvalued. Like, he might be a fine, like tight end 8 or whatever, but you can't draft him close to, I don't know, like the guys that are really going in the top 5. Like, you can't react to the top 5 tight ends going off the board by jumping right in with Evan Ingram. Like, you have to wait. Like, you have to understand that like his value relative to other tight ends is got to be a little bit worse than it was last year. Do you agree with this sort of assessment, or like what are you doing with this offense as a Giants fan?
Well, so it's different in Dynasty, right? Because Evan Ingram is a very young tight end who broke out early. And so I would be investing in him in Dynasty. If we're talking redraft, I totally see what you're saying. The one thing I'll say there, and I'm, I guess, an Evan Ingram apologist, or I don't think he'll see a ton of regression. I do think he will see some regression from last season, is 2 years ago, or maybe it's 3 years ago, they found a way to make Larry Donnell and Will Tye fantasy relevant because they love to target the tight end in the Giants offense historically, especially Eli. And it's not, and I know people always say, well, is that a play calling thing or is that a player thing? In Eli's case, he's had a few different play callers at this point. So if you look at his career, he really does actually, it's him who likes to target the tight end, it seems. And so I think there are going to be targets for Ingram. My concern actually is more for Sterling Shepard, who is my personal favorite player. I just really liked him coming out of college. I think he's going to be the one that gets hurt the most by the addition of Odell coming back and by Barkley being in the field. But I do agree with a good amount of the people who have said that Eli Manning is an undervalued option this year, because if he can even be halfway decent, I do think this is the best offensive pieces he's had in a while, and that will mean that he'll put up some fairly good fantasy points.
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I do think he's undervalued, but I think he's undervalued like all of the quarterbacks in like the QB 20 to QB 27 range are undervalued. Like Blake Bortles is undervalued, Ryan Tannehill is undervalued. Like all these guys who get disrespected because they aren't Aaron Rodgers, because they aren't Cam Newton, like those are the guys who have true like sleeper or whatever you want to call it, like deep value at the quarterback position, because they're going to put up points. They're going to have to pass the ball. That's how the NFL works. And they're essentially free compared to the guys you have to pay for. And so, yeah, like you should be targeting players like Eli Manning. The problem is that people want to elevate Eli Manning up to like quarterback 16 or quarterback 15 or whatever. Like that's
a little too early.
Right. That's too high for me. Like I can't. I mean, yeah, that might be his ceiling, but you can't draft him there. Like there are just too many other like reasonable guys who, I mean, the weapons for Eli are good. We talked about that chemistry between like a quarterback and his weapons, but there are plenty of other like quarterbacks who have proven to be like more like better passers in recent seasons, like in terms of yards per attempt, all that stuff, like all those efficiency metrics that you can't justify taking Eli, no matter how good his weapons are, I should say, over like those other guys. It doesn't make sense.
I would also like to point out that you're the first guest to beat me to mentioning Blake Bortles on this podcast. Maybe it's because you didn't know that I continually mention Blake Bortles on this podcast, but I continually mention Blake Bortles on this podcast.
Well, I think your first article at 2QBs.com was pretty much dedicated to Blake Bortles. So I know you're a Bortles guy. Like I'm just setting you up, man. What do you got? Let's talk about Bortles. How good is he going to be?
Well, see, here's the thing. So now I have to tell you that you have the Blake, which if you haven't listened to our episode of Jeff Miller, we go into great detail about the Blake, which is if you talk to me or interact with me in any way, you may find yourself drafting or trading for Blake Bortles, and therefore you've caught the Blake, and there's just no way of getting rid of it.
I saw a little bit of this on Twitter. I did not hear the episode, but I appreciated the tweets.
Yeah, so you now have the Blake, and you got it without even knowing you had it. That's the ridiculous part of this. But yeah, Blake Bortles, just to go into it really quickly, I say this almost every week. He's shown improvements on a real football skill level almost every year. And by that, I mean he's cut down on his interceptions. Yes, he still throws a lot. But Tom Coughlin, I don't know how many people know this, gave him a mandate to cut down on his interceptions last season. And he did it. And having Fournette there helped him be a bit more effective. I said this on last week's podcast. I actually think he has the best weapons he's had his entire career, even though Allen Robinson left. I just think all around he has the best weapons. And so I'm expecting big things for him this season. I'm going to be totally wrong because I have a bunch of bets on it. So no one should listen to me. I'm going down in the ship by myself. But I do believe that Blake Bortles is in for big things.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. Like, the way that team is constructed is kind of perfect for who Blake Bortles is as a player. Like, we know he's not accurate. We know he's not a great passer, but they have a dominant defense, which is going to set them up with, like, good field position a lot of the time. They have a dominant run game, or maybe not dominant, but they have a good running game, which takes pressure off the quarterback. He's a good runner himself, which complements having a good running game. And, you know, running as a quarterback is very sneakily good in fantasy. So, like, all that factored in with, like you said, like the kind of wealth of weapons that he has there, even though like some of those weapons aren't name brands, are not super exciting, like Keelan Cole, D.D. Westbrook. I mean, even Dante Moncrief is burned so many people at this point that I don't think anybody really likes him anymore. But the fact of the matter is that like between Dante Moncrief and Austin Seferian-Jenkins, like one of those guys is going to be a good touchdown threat. And the fact that they have both of them means that like they can get away with some deception in the red zone. And they have the deep threats with Cole and Westbrook, and like to like threaten those bigger plays from further away from the goal line. They have Marquise Lee, who's a good possession receiver. Like it is a really like kind of sneaky good setup for Bortles. And he, like we've talked about, he's essentially free. So you don't have to like pay up for Matt Ryan if you don't want to. Now in a 2-quarterback league or but even like a dynasty league, like 1 quarterback, like you can go to war with Blake Bortles in like a streaming combination with some other guys. Like I'm with you. Like he's totally a fine, reasonable play. Like I don't know if I'm going to be overdrafting him or placing bets on him necessarily, because I don't think he's that great of a quarterback, but the situation is good and that matters.
Yeah, and clearly I should just replace Sam with you for this podcast. And since you said nice things about Blake Bortles, Sam hates Blake Bortles. I'm pretty sure. Well, Sam is a Steelers fan, so I'm pretty sure it's 100% just because of the postseason.
That's my sneaky AFC team. I've kind of rooted for the Steelers for arbitrary reasons for many years, but I still like Blake Bortles, man. All right, like I said, fantasy over real life, you know, fan allegiances every day.
I'm not quite there. Not that many people know this about me, but there's only one team I hate, which is the Cowboys, and I will not draft or trade for any Cowboys players. And everyone always says, "Oh, that's a bad strategy. You won't win that way." First of all, I've won that way. Second of all, I play fantasy to have fun. And for me, it's not fun to root for a Cowboys player, so I won't do it. And there's nothing, and I understand, like from a pure strategy perspective, it's bad to cut off the pool of players you can trade for or play, but I've managed to find ways to make it work, and I'll never be convinced to stop doing it.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, honestly, you're 100% right. Like fantasy, you can win in so many different ways. There's no point in drafting someone you don't want to root for. Like, if you have a really big beef with like Adrian Peterson because he whipped his kid, like, which, you know, everybody should have a big beef with that. Like, you don't have to draft Adrian Peterson. You know what I mean? Like, and if you don't like a team and you don't want to root for players on that team in your fantasy lineup, then just don't draft them. Like, try to win some other way. It's totally possible.
I will say it is detrimental, though, if you're one of those people who like hates every real team except yours, then you might not want to follow that strategy.
That's a good point. Yeah, don't do that.
Because I definitely know some people who hate just you have no one to draft anymore.
How do you feel about the Jets as a New York Giants fan? Are they just like, is it like a stepbrother, like a little brother thing with them, or what? Like, explain to me the psychology there.
Sure. So I was at the first game I ever watched was a Jets-Patriots game, and I rooted for the Jets because I was watching with my brother-in-law who is a Patriots fan, and I really just wanted to root for the underdog. if I don't have a rooting interest in any sporting event, I'll find out who the underdog is and I'll root for them by default, just because it's always cool to see an upset. And so the Jets actually won that game. And I went to my dad and I said, I think I'm going to be a Jets fan. My dad said, no, we're Giants fans in this household. And that was pretty much the end of it. And
probably a smart move on his part, to be fair.
Yeah, it worked out in the long run for me. But I will say that I do watch the Jets games if I'm not doing anything else. So I'll watch both the Giants and Jets games. I generally support the Jets. There was one year when I was particularly annoyed at them because I went to a Giants-Jets game to watch at a bar and one of their fans was being particularly obnoxious. So I didn't want him to have any happiness in life, so I wanted them to lose every game. But generally speaking, I support them too. And I'm very interested to see what they do this year and bring it back to quarterbacks. You know, they just drafted Sam Darnold. They have Josh McCown. There's rumors now that they're talking about trading Teddy Bridgewater. And one I wanted to ask you was, where do you think Teddy Bridgewater will be traded if he is traded, and does he start there? And then also as a follow-up, who do you think is the starter week 1 for the Jets?
So, I mean, what sort of market even exists for teams that want to trade for quarterbacks? Like, we can talk about which teams could potentially want a guy like Bridgewater. Like, let's talk about some teams that should want Bridgewater, right? We could talk about the Los Angeles Rams, but they're not going to trade for him because they have Goff on his rookie deal. Like, there's too much of an advantage built into that, so they're not going to trade for him. And Goff could get better. I'm not a big Goff guy, but, you know, it's possible that he's, you know, at this point, a more valuable commodity than Bridgewater, especially because Bridgewater has had the injuries, and those things tend to, like, down the road propagate. Like, Goff has stayed relatively healthy. Like, I get it. Like, the Rams could consider it, but they won't do it. The Buffalo Bills probably need a quarterback, but they're not going to trade for Bridgewater because they just drafted Josh Allen. Sal's going to hate me for saying this, but Washington could use a quarterback. I mean, they won't do it because they just paid Alex Smith a small fortune. But and like, I know that Washington sees Smith as an upgrade or at least an equivalent to Kirk Cousins. But before last season, Smith was a replacement level guy among quarterbacks. And I think if Bridgewater ends up being more than that, Washington may regret the path that they've chosen. But that's not to say that they had the pieces to trade for Bridgewater either. We could talk about like the Broncos maybe, but they probably won't do it because they just paid Case Keenum. But I guess if Keenum implodes this year, like his contract is probably short enough to where I could see the Broncos making a move for Bridgewater. But I think that giving Chad Kelly a shot makes a lot more sense for them. So I don't see them making a move. I can't remember who it was on the two-a-days for the 2QBXP pod throughout the Buccaneers. I think it might have been Matt Kelly throughout the Buccaneers as a potential landing spot just because of they might just be tired of the off-field issues with Jameis Winston. So, I mean, that would be an awesome landing spot if Bridgewater ended up there. But are they going to trade for him while they still have Jameis? Like, I don't see that happening. We could talk about your Giants, man. I think this is.
I was going to say, I wanted the Giants to sign Teddy Bridgewater when he was a free agent because I thought that he still had some upside. And they obviously passed on a quarterback in the draft, which honestly, if you haven't checked it out, Sam posted a video of me and he reposted it recently. I nearly fainted when they announced Barkley as the pick because I really wanted a quarterback.
Sure, as you should have.
Yeah, I would approve of the Giants trading some kind of mid-round pick for Teddy Bridgewater. Don't get me wrong, I actually really want to see what Kyle Lauletta can do. I'm not a Davis Webb guy. Lauletta, I'm like kind of intrigued by, but I would much rather have Teddy Bridgewater than Kyle Lauletta.
Yeah, I mean, we know that Davis Webb isn't the guy because the Giants started Geno Smith over him last year. Like, and again, that was a justifiable move considering the way that Eli was playing. I will go to my grave saying that Geno Smith should have been the starter for the rest of that season, but I digress. Honestly, I think it just makes too much sense for the Giants to go after Teddy, so they probably won't do it.
Just like it made too much sense for them to make a quarterback the pick at too.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if they were smart about how they were going to handle their quarterback position, they would have, done a lot of different things. So we can kind of rule them out, unfortunately. Apologies to, Bobby Koch, the number 2 Blake Bortles fan on earth, but the Jaguars could make sense. The Bengals could make sense, but kind of like Eli, I mean, Andy Dalton is kind of still entrenched there, but his time could be running out. We could see them make a move. We should talk about the Dolphins as a landing spot. Like, that might be the most realistic destination for Bridgewater, but it's pretty unappealing for fantasy, so I don't really want to talk about that. I want to talk about some dark horse teams, man. Like, how about Chicago? Like, what if Trubisky isn't good? How about Oakland? What if Carr isn't good? Or how about New Orleans, where Bridgewater could be just like a really great fit as Breeze's understudy and eventual replacement? Like, I think there's a lot of crossover there in terms of how those guys play and, you know, the skill set that they each have as kind of like hyper accurate throwers. Like that's a sneaky good spot, like kind of long term. And based on the fact that like Bridgewater doesn't have a ton of trade value because so many of these teams probably feel like they are set at QB, like we could see him being traded to be a backup, right? So I don't know, like pick one of those teams to talk about, like Miami, Jacksonville, Cincy, Chicago, Oakland, New Orleans. Like, where would you want to see him end up? Like, I think if I could pick, I would like to see him go to the Bucks because that's a great situation. But among the teams that are more realistic, like New Orleans as a backup and a potential replacement for Breeze, like that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that like we wouldn't see him start this year unless Breeze got hurt, but I think that would be a nice fit.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. Although a few weeks back on another episode of this podcast, I did make, I believe, a bold prediction. If not, I'm making it now, which is that Andy Dalton will only have about a year, maybe two left on the Bengals, because I think there's going to be a head coaching change. And I think with the head coaching change, they're going to bring in a new quarterback. And so I'm not saying his career is going to be over because he might go somewhere else and serve as a bridge. But I think his time as Bengals is running out unless they have a really good season. So I could see that being a good landing spot, although AJ Green's getting a bit older. He's not super old, but he is getting older. And then behind him, there's a lot of either unproven pass catching options, or they're hurt ones like Tyler Eifert. So I'm not really sure I love the fit. New Orleans, when you said that, made a lot of sense, especially because they do have a lot of young talent there too. Mm-hmm. I love Traquan Smith. Michael Thomas is obviously great. Alvin Kamara can help a quarterback out by catching some passes and learning from Breeze. Anytime, I know what we always build up this narrative as fantasy analysts of, oh, this player's going to go there and actually learn from this player. But everything you hear about Drew Brees is that Drew Brees is like an incredibly great guy. So he seems like the exact kind of guy who would take a young player under his wing and mentor them. And I don't think that Taysom Hill or JT Barrett are necessarily going to be the future of the Saints franchise. So I could definitely see Bridgewater being a good fit there.
Yeah, getting back to your follow-up about like what the Jets are going to do, I think it makes the most sense for them to go with Darnold in week one and just for the whole season. I mean, by most accounts, he's looked good in camp and in preseason. And let's be real, the Jets aren't winning the Super Bowl, so it really makes sense to get Darnold some NFL reps, against real defenses. And in general, like history with those high equity quarterback picks is on Darnold's side. Since 2008, I think quarterbacks drafted in the top 10 have started an average of at least 12 games in their rookie season, like 12 plus games on average. So it stands to reason that Darnold is going to be the guy in their week one, and that McCown's only going to come in if Darnold really struggles, or if Darnold gets hurt. And if that happens, like, I think they'd probably just turn to Bridgewater instead, assuming Bridgewater's still on the roster. Like, because I don't know if they're going to be able to trade him. That just doesn't seem super feasible. Although, I don't know, like trades are definitely becoming more commonplace in the NFL. Like Garoppolo getting traded midseason last year was pretty crazy. Like no one saw that coming, I don't think. Maybe not no one, but it's like that's not something you would often see in years previous, was like a marquee quarterback or like a player that most people knew of getting traded to a team and then becoming the starter. Like I don't necessarily know if we're going to see that with Bridgewater because there isn't a whole lot of precedent for it outside of last year.
Yeah, that felt a bit like Bill Belichick just messing with everybody because he could, which seems like a typical Bill Belichick move.
Speaking of narrative.
Yeah, and then as for Teddy getting traded, so I will say in the local New York media, there are some people who think that he should start for a few games because the Jets have a particularly tough schedule to begin the season. Sure. So they're saying they should start him and then start Darnold after just because they don't want to ruin his confidence. I think you just start him from week one. You drafted him in the top 10. Yep. He's going to have to learn how to play against tough teams eventually. You might as well just put him in there and see what happens.
Yeah. And if he gets knocked around too much, like that's when you pull him out and throw one of those other guys in there. Yeah, I think you got to get him the reps. Like there's so little practice time for players these days. There's so little game time for these players that if you invest that much in a player, top of the draft, you got to get him in there sooner rather than later just so they can kind of get up to speed with what the NFL is. And I think that's the biggest argument for Baker Mayfield over Tyrod Taylor right now too. And like, Hugh Jackson can say all he wants that Tyrod Taylor's the starter. Like, they're planning for him to remain the starter. Like, whatever. I don't care. Like, they drafted Baker Mayfield for a reason, and he's going to get in there and start at some point this season. It might not be till week 10, but it might also just be in like week 3 after Hugh Jackson gets fired. Like, we don't know. And with that in mind, like, I think Tyrod's only really like a draftable guy if you're streaming early in season. Like, in a 2-quarterback league, the only quarterback I want from Cleveland is Baker, because he's the guy who has like the chance to start the most games. I think like history favors him in terms of that stuff.
Yeah. And it's really just interesting to think about these quarterbacks. I mean, I'm not obviously an NFL coach, but I would think that more experience doing whatever your job is generally a good thing, even if you're new at it, is a more actual experience as opposed to theoretical experience you get, or, in practice in this case, the better. Mm-hmm. So the more live game experience they'd get, I think that'd be better for their long-term development. Again, I'm not claiming to be an expert, because I know some people saying, no, if you sit them for a year, that's actually better for their development. And that could be right. Just from my personal experience of how outside of football I deal with things. If I get hands-on experience of what I'm doing, that's better for me in the long run.
No, I'm the same way. Learn by doing, man. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how I feel about those guys. And Baker Mayfield is also another friend of the podcast, although he's not really friends with the podcast. But we've mentioned in the past that Baker Mayfield has a huge eclair he likes to grab. So that's Baker's eclair for people who forgot about that. And I'd like to see him doing that on the sidelines all season long, as I just really like his attitude. I know some people have a problem with it. It's the same with I want to hear quarterbacks say they want to be the best and like, don't come at me or I'll come at you. I know some people have a problem with that, but I just love that about Baker.
Isn't that what makes Tom Brady good? Isn't that what makes Phillip Rivers good? Like, these guys getting animated and like fired up about playing football. Like, I don't know why you would want to discourage that in a player. Like, so much of this game, like the NFL, like football, and so much of just sports and life in general is about having the confidence to try stuff and to do stuff. Like, I don't want a guy who's going to hesitate. I don't want a guy who's going to be timid, in his role on a team. Like, I want a guy who thinks he can go out there and do it. Like, yeah, like, hell yeah, I totally want that from Baker Mayfield. He's awesome for that reason. Like, why would you try to discourage that? It doesn't make any sense.
Could you imagine having a self-deprecating quarterback? Like, oh, I don't know if I'm the best for the job. Sorry, guys. Like, sorry, I'm really bad at this.
If you did that, you would have to be really good, right? Like, if it was like kind of tongue in cheek, like, man, like I meant to hit you like 1 centimeter further to the left, and then like you really would have like made that look spectacular or something. You know what I mean? Like, you're right. That's not a trait that you want, and not just quarterback. I think that applies to every position. Like, you have to get go-getters. You got it. Like, that's where that Jarvis Landry stuff starts to make sense, right? It's like, you want guys who are going to hustle. You want guys who are going to play hard and play within themselves, like do the best that they possibly can when they're on the field, because it's a short season. Like, there aren't that many opportunities to make plays. Like, go out there and try to make them, man.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I will say the one thing for Jarvis Landry, and this is just a personal thing that I didn't like, I don't like when people call other people out on injuries. You just don't. You're not a doctor. You don't know how bad that is. But I agree with his speech of just try your hardest. That part I'll agree to.
That's fair. I recently deleted a tweet where I joked about Sam Bradford getting injured because I felt like bad about it. I was like, I shouldn't be making these types of jokes. This is not okay. But yeah, I totally agree. Like, calling somebody out for like being hurt is kind of messed up. But I don't know. Like, the Jarvis Landry should have that mentality. He just shouldn't say that stuff to the media. Like, Hard Knocks is such a cancer, man. Like, if I owned an NFL franchise, like, Hard Knocks wouldn't come anywhere near my team. Like, that just, it's not happening.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. There's a difference between what's said in a locker room without cameras and what's said with cameras, and what's meant for the public and what's not. And maybe that's one of those things that wasn't really meant for the public to see, but not many of these NFL players have training in what should be said in front of cameras and what shouldn't be said in front of cameras.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to like speak to Jarvis Landry and his motivation for doing that, but I don't know. Like, yeah, he could have handled that better, and like doing it in front of a camera was just a bad idea.
Yeah, and totally unrelated to quarterback's note, but just related to Hard Knocks note, I don't blame Josh Gordon at all for staying the hell away from that facility, especially if his reasoning is he didn't want to be on Hard Knocks. He has way too much going on to have to deal with that too.
My eyes just got really wide. I'm nodding vigorously. I'm just going to describe to the listeners what I'm doing right now. Yes, like do what you have to do to stay healthy and to stay sober if that's important to you, man. Like all due respect to Josh Gordon.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like we both love Josh Gordon, and I did want to talk to you about a player you love. So you mentioned Sal earlier, Sal Stefanali. He loves Alex Smith, and it's on T-shirts. It's all over the 2QB's website. Anytime you talk to Sal, it's similar to me with Blake Bortles. He's probably like the originator of this. Like if there's the Blake, then maybe there was the Smith first. I'm not really sure. But who is your player that you feel that way about? And it can be quarterback or not quarterback. I intended the question to be quarterback related, but maybe there is a player that's not quarterback related that you feel that way about.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have that sort of passion towards one particular player that Sal does with Alex Smith. Like that's definitely a very Sal thing. I can't try to like claim that sort of brand. Like, and this really comes down to me being like an avid gamer, like not just a fantasy gamer, but like a gamer. Like I'm always looking for like just optimal strategies when I play. And in terms of fantasy and in terms of like watching football, that really leads me to be pretty player agnostic. Like I wrote about this on a recent blog post for the Draft Day Consultants website, where like, especially as people are getting smarter, like I don't lock in on like one particular player like that. Like I don't have my guys, because chances are if like I really like a player, a lot of other people are really going to like that player. But if we're looking for like, I'm just going to kind of translate this to quarterbacks and guys that I've really enjoyed rooting for in recent seasons. Like in recent history, probably the best example of this is Colin Kaepernick. And I mean, this is where some Niners bias definitely comes in. Like, but at the same time, like I just love mobile quarterbacks, and I liked the way that Kaepernick could just kind of completely eviscerate a defense either with his arm or with his legs. Like that season he took them to the Super Bowl was incredible for me, like as a fan. And honestly, like the off the field stuff, like apologies to your listeners who, you know, want everyone to stand for the anthem, but like I'm all about freedom of speech and freedom of protest, and like that stuff matters to me as an American. So when Colin Kaepernick's doing what he's doing, like I'm okay with that and I support that. So like him as a player, like seeing him be ostracized from the league, like makes me like him more, if anything. So apologies to you for everybody who just had to turn off the podcast.
You don't have to apologize. So first of all, we've burned the entire city of Cleveland once, so we don't have any listeners from there. Second of all, after one of the rallies, Sam felt compelled, and I did too a bit, to talk about some political things that weren't related to football. So most people who would be pro standing for the anthem and anti-Kaepernick probably don't listen to this podcast anymore.
Well, I mean, it's too bad you lost all your Cleveland listeners, because like the active player that fits this bill for me is Taylor. And I just recently heard that it's not Tyrod, it's Tyrod, and he's never corrected anybody. Have you heard about this?
No, I haven't heard about that at all.
Yeah, I heard about this, I think, on the Ringer NFL show, and they brought it up, and they had read it somewhere. And I haven't read that article, so I'd have to go and search that up. But man, that's wild. Like that, I get it. Like you don't want to have to correct somebody every time, especially like if your name is spelled a certain way, like people are going to pronounce it a certain way. Like that just makes sense. So I get it, Tyrod. And I'm going to try to be better about this. This is like maybe we could save this for like the burns of the week at the end of the episode, but like people who like actively come out and say, no, my name isn't Mitch Trubisky, it's Mitchell Trubisky, please call me Mitchell. Like I want to respect that. You know what I mean? Because if people called me Greg Smythe or Craig Smythe, like that would piss me off. Like I don't want to deal with that shit. So like, I don't know, like if his name is Tyrod, then I'm going to try to keep up with that. So I'm going to hunt down that article and check it out. But end of that sidebar, like Tyrod Taylor is up there for me in terms of like current players who, again, kind of what you were talking about, like rooting for underdogs. Like I like that Tyrod Taylor has kind of always been that underdog type player, and mostly just because he played for the Bills. But you know what I mean? Like he kept them respectable for many years, and he was just a great fantasy player. And so I have this special affinity for Taylor that I don't have for a lot of other players, and it bums me out because in my 2 quarterback leagues, like I talked about, like I'm not going to draft him much because I think Baker Mayfield's the guy.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. Also, very interesting point about his name. I never knew that it wasn't Tyrod.
I just found that out today.
Tyrod. And I will say, I don't know how much of a Parks and Recreation fan you are, but that reminds me of the whole like Jerry, Gary, Larry situation.
I forgot about that. Yeah, I've watched that show through one time, but I haven't revisited it much. But I do remember, yeah, poor Gary.
Yeah, so
Wait, which was it? Remind me. Is it Jerry? They all call him Jerry, but his real name Gary?
They call him Jerry, but his real name is Gary, and he never bothered to correct them. So I guess what we're saying here is that Tyrod is the Jerry of the NFL. We'll have to figure out who the other Parks and Rec people are in the NFL, but we've already found our Jerry or Gary or Larry or whatever his other like 3 names were.
If there's a Jerry/Gary/Larry division in the Scott Fish Bowl, we're going to have to find all those people on Twitter and make them change their avatars to have Tyrod in there instead.
Absolutely. After we find the Ringer article, and we'll link that from our podcast as well, just because I'm sure many people would be interested to know we've been calling him the wrong name for a few seasons.
So to be clear, I heard it on a Ringer podcast and they referred to some other article. So I don't know who wrote the article or where the article is posted, but yeah, that convoluted way of finding out that his name is actually Tyrod and not Tyrod. It's crazy.
Yeah, we'll do some investigative journalism, some really hardcore, staying up all night, trying to figure this out, interviewing some people, talking to some pronunciation professors, and it will be figured out.
I like it.
But we do have to wrap up here, Greg, and we're running a little bit low on time, but this is everyone's favorite segment coming up, or I think it's one of our listeners' favorite segments. This is our Burns of the Week, or our Afterburns. And I think one of the reasons it's our listeners' favorite segment is I'm generally a very nice person, especially on Twitter. I probably portray myself as nicer on Twitter than I am in real life. And I think people enjoy this opportunity to hear me just be a jerk to something of the week and hear Sam be a jerk of something, and our guests. Now, we don't necessarily have an order, so I know you have a few that you like to go. So if you would like to do like one first, and then I can go, and then you can go again, or you can go however many you have after I do mine, it's really up to you.
I've got 2, and one of them is kind of a simple sports problem, and the other is like a more personal vendetta I have with a Twitter troll. So let's get the Twitter troll one out of the way right away, because this is something that everybody, I think, can empathize with. And my burn of the week is for the verbiage troll on Twitter, who went out of his way to flame me for using the phrase, quote, positive regression in an article instead of using a word like progression. Now, regression is a statistics term. Regression can be positive. For example, if a player had a bad season in a particular stat category, say Marcus Mariota and his 2.9% touchdown rate in 2017, he can regress back toward the mean or the baseline that he set across his entire career. So I could have simply written that Marcus Mariota will regress, and it would have been correct. But because not everyone realizes, not every reader is going to realize that regression can be positive because there is that negative connotation with the word, it's important for me, the writer, to help the readers, to alert them by leading in with the word positive, to indicate that the regression I'm projecting is actually a good thing for the player. On the other hand, progression, as this guy wanted me to use, would suggest some sort of evolution. Mariota improving on his overall baseline as a quarterback. And while that certainly could happen this season, and it's in the range of outcomes for Mariota, that's not what I was trying to illustrate when I referred to his, quote, positive regression. I was simply saying that he could recoil towards his baseline, toward the precedent that he had set in previous years. So in the case of Mariota, that's regression toward the mean in a positive direction. Positive regression. Deal with it and get the fuck out of my mentions.
So essentially what we're saying here is that if you are a verbiage Nazi, leave Greg alone, leave everyone alone, and really just don't.
I mean, language is flexible, man. Language can be used in a lot of different ways. Like I can say the word can, and I could be referring to a verb, or I could be referring to a small piece of aluminum. Like the word might I could say I might go to the store. Or I could say like he struck down his fist on the other man's head with great might. Like, understand that words can be twisted and have different meanings. Like people speak different languages. Like this is a statistics language I was trying to use. And this asshole like could not stop tweeting at me about this. And it's like, who cares, man? You knew what I meant. Deal with it.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's really hard to follow up to, because I thought about it. Normally I have a lot of things to complain about. I keep them mostly in my head and save them for this particular podcast, but I've had a really good week, so I don't have that much to complain about. However, I do have one thing, which is that I was in a very good mood, as I mentioned. So I was being particularly polite, which happens when I'm in a particular good mood. And what I mean by that is, like, I'll go out of my way to say hello to people, even though I'm in New York and that's not that common. I'll go out of my way to, like, hold the door, for example. So I was holding a door for two young women who were talking to each other, and neither of them said thank you or anything like that. And I thought, okay, that's fine. They're just talking to each other. Then I held another door because it was a series of doors in a hallway for them. Neither of them were talking to each other at that point, and neither of them said thank you. So I don't know how they were raised, and I know that we live in New York, and I know that everyone's meant to be a jerk in New York. But generally speaking, if somebody holds a door for you, you say the words thank you. It might, if you're like on a phone call and like can't do it, or you're in mid-conversation, fine. But I'm pretty sure your parents had the good sense to tell you that if someone holds the door for you, you say thank you. Maybe they didn't, and maybe I should be taking issue with their parents, but these particularly entitled young women in this particular neighborhood in New York, you have officially been burned.
I'm going to push back on you here. They didn't ask you to hold the door for them, man. You could have just walked in and I don't know.
I will say there are probably some people who will be like, oh, that's very chauvinist of you. To my defense, I did not go out of my way to hold the door for them. They were just directly behind me, and I held the door because I think that's the polite thing to do for anybody of any gender and any age.
So the logistics of this are weird to me. It's like you held the door for them once, they went in that door, and then you like lapped them to hold another door?
So the way it works is there's a security building or a security that I have to walk through for my apartment building because I have to go through it with my dog because he's not allowed in the main lobby. So you open a door to go into this little like security thing, you swipe your ID, and then you open another door and you're in the main building. So I opened the first door to get into like the little security lobby, and then I opened the second door because I was still like directly ahead of them after I swiped in.
So the first door holding was like I'm already through the door, but I'm propping it for you from the inside?
Exactly.
Okay, and so you were still ahead of them. I'm glad we cleared that up. That's very important.
Yeah. I mean, I understand what you said. They didn't ask me to hold the door, but at the same time, if somebody held the door for you, how much effort does it take to say thank you?
No, I would say thank you. Now, the other way to look at this is maybe you shouldn't have held the door for them because what if they didn't have a security guard to get in through that, or a security card to get in through that door? You might have let criminals into your building, Bobby.
So I thought of that, and to answer your question, they had already swiped in. So I knew that they lived in the building. I did not let criminals in. I have, however, one time a guy came up to this totally separate story, but this is time for a tangent, I guess. Another guy did come up to that door, and he looked super lost, I guess, but like he looked normal to me, and he looked like he wanted to get in, and I did let him in. So if something bad happened to the building, it would have been totally my fault. And I thought about that like immediately. I didn't think about it when I was letting him in. I was just like, oh, this guy needs to get in. And then later I realized, wow, I could have really messed things up there.
What does a normal person look like?
That's a great question. I don't think we have the time to get into that in this podcast.
I asked the hard-hitting questions, dude.
But when you live in New York, all I can say is you start to adapt a sense of like who's at least relatively normal. Because in New York, relative is the key word there because most of us are not normal, and who is a little on the off side.
I could see it. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm generally of the opinion that most people are not normal. Like everybody's got some weird quirk to them. But I want to squeeze in one more burn here, and this is kind of a general burn. I'm going to say fuck halls of fame. Every hall of fame, all of them. These are museums that are completely biased. Like politics are way far too heavily involved in how any Hall of Fame works. They all have some, requisite of like arbitrary eligibility. Like that's really stupid. Like if I want to learn the history of a sport and that sport's most best or most interesting players, or we can apply this to to music, like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Like Spotify exists. Google exists. I can just go online to find out whatever I want to know about music, sports, pop culture, whatever. Like the internet makes every Hall of Fame obsolete get the hell out of here. I don't care about any Hall of Fame ever again. Like, I can just go to, Pro Football Reference, Baseball Reference, sportsreference.com, like Spotify for music, like whatever. Like, I don't care. I'm out in Hall of Fame.
I take it you're not a sports memorabilia guy then.
I am not. Like, I actually probably still have some baseball cards lying around my house somewhere, but like the aspect of like collectability, unless what I'm collecting has some sort of function, I don't care. Like, I collect records because I can listen to records and because I enjoy the aspect of like putting an album on my turntable and not being able to skip songs, like being forced to listen to an entire 4 songs in a row by the same band recorded like in the same general period of time. Like, that's cool to me and that's interesting to me. But if like, even that is a silly collection, I'll admit, because like digital music exists. Like, I still like have a way more MP3s than I would ever have of like, vinyl records and tracks on my records. But like, to me, that tactile experience of like putting a record on and being forced to listen to the whole half of it, at least before getting it out of there, like that's cool. Like, I find that interesting. But for like, I don't know, like a baseball card, a football card, or a jersey, or, a signed helmet or baseball, like, nah, I don't really care. Like, whatever.
Well, consider my dad burned because he spends all of his time on eBay buying sports memorabilia, and our house is essentially, or my parents' house is essentially a Hall of Fame. But I will say, I understand what you're saying only because I generally like to get practical gifts or gifts that I can actually use instead of just something that'll sit and clutter. So I can definitely relate to that, and I guess that's an additional burn on my part on people who don't like practical gifts.
Well, and don't get me wrong, like there's something to be said for curation, for like taking like a certain subset of something, like my record collection, or like when Bill Simmons writes the Book of Basketball and does his own like Hall of Fame pyramid and talks about like, a bunch of like interesting things about one sport that he really cares about. Like, there's value in that, and that's cool. But like, for the people who get bent out of shape because like Pete Rose isn't in the Hall of Fame or Barry Bonds isn't in the Hall of Fame, like that, like Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame, like if the Hall of Fame was at all serious, and so should Pete Rose. But like why stress over that stuff? Because it doesn't matter. Like, you can go and Google like best baseball players ever, and Barry Bonds at some point is going to come up in that list. You know what I mean? Pete Rose is going to be part of that discussion. He doesn't have to have a plaque in Cooperstown. Like, that is nonsense. And if you're going to like get hung up on that, like, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you can, like, information is so widespread now, and like art and culture is so widespread and so easily accessible through the internet that like, you really do not have to lean that heavily into like takes on like why the Hall of Fame matters, why the Hall of Fame screwed up. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's not important. It's one person's curation. Like I'm not going to go into your dad's house and be like, oh, well, this helmet sucks. Like, get this helmet out of here. Like, why don't you have a Joe Montana signed helmet? This is bullshit. It's like, that's what your dad cares about. Let your dad be stoked on that. Like, and I guess let the people in Cooperstown be stoked on how they assume to like document the sport. But in terms of like true history of something, like Cooperstown isn't it, man. Like, the internet is it. I'm sorry.
Well, so Greg, if people want to @ you to wrap up the show, where can they find you and where can they find your work?
This is like the most animated I think I've ever been on a podcast. So I appreciate you letting me do that. And I have like great fear of my mentions after doing this. But if you want to @ me, just, engage with me in a respectful manner, like, and have a discussion with me, and that's fine. @ Greg Sauce on Twitter. You can come check out 2qbs.com. And again, you spell that out with letters, TWOQBS. The handle for Twitter at the site is the same, @2qbs. I do a podcast called the 2QB Experience. And just to be as confusing as possible, in that case, there's a number in there. It's the numeral 2 and then QB Experience. I'm wrapping up like a big project I did for that podcast called Two-A-Days, where I have like 2 different analysts from around the industry on each episode. And we basically dive deep into each analyst's like personal experience, like, some Dynasty guys, some DFS guys, some 2QB guys, some 1QB guys, talking all about the position. So come check that out. Subscribe to the podcast. Leave me a rating and review. That would be awesome. I appreciate you letting me getting all these plugs in without interrupting me, Bobby. You are the best. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem whatsoever.
Hold on. I'm going to interrupt you now. Interrupt myself. I have one more plug.
Go for it.
The 2QBs.com draft guide, and you were a part of this. So why don't you plug it? Like, help us out here. Like, talk about the guide and how awesome it is.
Sure. Well, what I was going to say is, one, I'm a regular listener, at least when I can be, to the Two Quarterback Experience. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure you do. Greg does a great job, and he always has great hosts on that podcast. Great guests on that podcast.
The host is pretty good, too.
The host is pretty good. As for the 2QB draft guide, we were actually giving one out just because this episode was a little bit different than usual without Sam. We will push that to the next time we do that, which brings me to another note, which is that the podcast may be less regular from now on. We're discussing it. Sam just got a full-time job. As many of you know, I just started business school, so I may have a little bit less time to make this a weekly thing. It may be bi-weekly or monthly. We're figuring it out. We'll let you know as soon as we do. But to get back to the Two Quarterback Draft Guide in general, that thing is so full of information from people who spend all their time thinking about quarterbacks, and then somehow I ended up writing an article in it. But if you want to know anything there is to know about quarterbacks, and my favorite part is probably the in-depth draft profiles that were given to you primarily by Greg, and I believe it was also Anthony Amixta. I apologize if I pronounced your name wrong, Anthony. Greg, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about any of this information. It's been a while since I've read the guide, but I did read it when it first came out, and I was very impressed by all the information in there and would highly recommend it to anybody in 2 quarterback leagues or Superflex. And I know this is an important issue to everybody, but it's an important issue to me. Some percentage of the sales does go towards NCADV, which is the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So not only are you getting a ton of great information about quarterbacks, but you're also helping a great cause.
Yep. 10% of each sale is going to go to the NCADV. And what I did last year was I matched that total personally. So whatever amount we sell of the draft guide, I'm going to match that donation myself to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Those quarterback capsules you talked about are really great. The analysis on those were done by Anthony Amico at Amixta on Twitter, AMICSTA. That sounds right. And Derek Klassen at QB Class. So Amixta, Anthony gave the fantasy outlook, and Derek Klassen did the scouting side of it, like the film watching side of it, like a profile on each quarterback. And we're talking about 60 different quarterbacks. So we go super deep. We talk about, relevant rookies, relevant backups, everything you want to learn about quarterbacks. We have, statistics on each of those capsules that talk about not just like passing yards, passing touchdowns, interceptions, dropbacks and completions, but also like fantasy relevant stats, like how often this quarterback finishes in the top 10, how often they finish in the top 20 at their position, what their average weekly finish is, like super cool stats on the quarterback position. You can find a lot of that stuff out there. Like we have that stuff posted on 2QBs.com too in our QB cards, but the capsules also give you those breakdowns by Anthony and Derek, which are super cool. Plus you get all the awesome articles. Like, yeah, you were very modest about your article, Bobby. That was like a really good intro to the QB or the 2QB format. So Bobby's article is great. I have an article in there about like the 2QB mock drafts that we ran last season, and we ran them all as best ball drafts. And so basically like we take all of the data from that best ball, and I figured out, what was the optimal draft slot? Was it first pick, second pick, third pick? I also looked at what the optimal like roster construction was. Like, do you want 4 running backs or 5 running backs? Do you want 3 QBs or 4 QBs? Do you want to draft wide receiver at the beginning of the draft? Do you want to draft quarterback, or running back, wide receiver? So I look at all that stuff too. Super interesting stuff. And obviously that changes from year to year, but like looking at how that played out last year and looking at it through the context of how the season played out, I think is super important to say like, okay, what were the dominant strategies last season? How is that going to apply to this year? Like knowing what we know now, and what did the data say, in hindsight. So cool stuff. The draft guide's awesome. I only have like a small part of it. Like most of the written content in there is from other amazing writers, including yourself, Bobby. So if people want to check that out and buy a copy and, make that contribution to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I'd be super stoked on that. And man, that's all I got to say on that. Please check it out.
And you can tell just by how excitedly Greg was talking about it, that it was a passion of love project for both him and Sal, and the writers they got together on that were just quite the collective of writers. They're all people that you probably know in the fantasy industry, so definitely check that out. But that's going to do it for us this week, guys. As always, you can find me on Twitter at RekFantasy. That's REKED Fantasy. I'm not a Twitter tough guy. As John Bosch likes to say, you can always tweet at me. And this has been the Afterburners Pod. That's at Afterburners Pod on Twitter. Pretty easy. Please make sure you rate and review us on iTunes and subscribe on Podbean and anywhere else you can listen on podcast listening platforms. Until next time, keep it classy, Fantasy Twitter.
I went down, 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 and the flames went higher, and it burns, burns, burns.